I think it's time now. So welcome everyone to the first afternoon session, panel 3, Democracy and Utopia between East and West. We have 3 speakers in this session, and the first speaker of the session is Professor Zsolt Czigányik. And Zsolt Czigányik is an associate professor at the Department of English Studies at Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest and a Gerda Henkel Fellow at the CEU Democracy Institute. Yes, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Emma. And welcome everyone. I'd like to talk about democracy and the relationship of democracy and leadership, especially in 19th century Hungarian utopias. The starting point is that there seems to be a consensus in contemporary Western European political thought about the necessity of a democratic pattern in an ideal society. Actually, this was just challenged by Ferenc Woronski quite recently. Nevertheless, as Furet and Kostopoulos argue, since the 18th century, democracy has presented itself to the modern individual as a promise of liberty, or more precisely of autonomy. This is in contrast to earlier times when men were viewed as subjects and consequently were deprived of the right of self-determination. End of quote. You might also remember that earlier today, Luisa Passerini said that the insertion of subjectivity in the 19th century meant that everyone is right to be a subject of their own life. This is what I'm also talking about. Nevertheless, there seems to be a significant difference between Western and Central or Eastern European utopianism as far as the role of democracy is concerned. 19th century Hungarian utopian texts, for instance, often highlight the problematic aspects of democratic societies, particularly when contrasted with regimes centered around benevolent, enlightened rulers. The differences from the Western European attitudes may well be connected to the historical experiences of the region. For instance, that in Western Europe, constitutional monarchies and democratic states based on the rule of law developed earlier. We have to take into consideration what Trencsényi and his co-authors, including Monika Bar, who is present, what they were calling the regular import of Western ideas into Central European political thought. As they argue, such imports mean that, quote, paradigms originating in Western European context had to be negotiated in a setting marked by radically different local conditions. Thus, the conflicts and ambiguities surrounding the Western European paradigms became even sharper and more visible, end of quote. As a case study of how the concept of democracy is negotiated in Central Europe, I will focus on 2 Hungarian utopian texts, The Voyage of Tariménes by György Bessenyei and The Tragedy of Man by Imre Madács. Tariménes is the first complex utopia written by a Hungarian author, not counting some lost pieces. It is essentially an optimistic yet sharp satire of an enlightened writer who suffers from the backwardness of Habsburg rule in Hungary. György Bessenyei was a nobleman from the eastern part of Hungary who joined the Hungarian Guards, or Leibgarde, of Queen and Empress Maria Theresa in Vienna, an organization established for the education and imperial indoctrination of the youth of the Hungarian nobility. In 1772, Bessenyei left the Guard and published several plays and significant pamphlets, which made him the father of modern Hungarian literature in Loránd Cigány's words. 10 years later, at the age of 35, Bessenyei returned to Bihar, his provincial homelands in the east of Hungary, so not Bihar in India. It was a self-imposed exile, as he could no longer publish his writings due to censorship after Joseph II's accession to the throne. You can see the difference between his homeland in the east of Hungary and, as you can imagine, what imperial Vienna looked like. He continued writing mainly for his desk and completed Tariménes in 1804, but it was only circulated in manuscript form, and it was as late as 1930, so more than 100 years later, when it was published for the first time. Tariménes is not a well-structured book. Its complexities and cumbersome language make it rather difficult to read, yet the intellectual richness of its social criticism and the irony and humor of the text aim for the efforts. Nevertheless, in the following, I'm trying to save you the trouble of having to read this 500 pages. The book is a summary of Bessenyei's political thought and an important document of the Hungarian reception of Enlightenment ideas. A core element is the search for an ideal political structure which is understood as a constitutional monarchy. The narrative centers around our protagonist, young Tariménes, who starts a journey with his tutor, and they visit the land of Totopos. Totopos, it's easy to find the name of Utopos, the imaginary king of Thomas More's Utopia. And this is a utopian country whose central idea is that one can rise without repressing the other. That's the opposite of what Bessenyei experienced in everyday life. Totopos is ruled by the ideal Queen Artemis, who resembles but also excels Maria Theresa, Holy Roman Empress and Queen of Hungary. The principles of the rule of Queen Artemis are based on the will of her people and the respect of laws. Quote, I confine myself under the law in order that I may be above it. All ruling powers are the strongest when they are the most just. Happy are those rulers who wish to own the hearts of their people and not their money. Beyond the importance of the rule of law, a central element of a democratic society, equality, is also a significant issue in Totopos. Nevertheless, differences amongst people, especially based on their intellectual capacities, are taken for granted. Yet these differences are coupled with an equality before the law and limitations on taxation, conditions that in early 19th century Hungary seemed utopian, similarly to the lack of oppression and exploitation in Totopos. The differences between people are manifest in the hierarchy of the parliament, where only higher ranks are present, common people are excluded, and the queen, after opening the session, withdraws so that she does not interfere with the workings of the parliament. The positive features of Totopos are counterpointed by the neighboring country called Jaigádia, which is a rather witty name meaning land of sorrows. At a certain moment in the narrative, Totopos is threatened by the despotic ruler of this country. The contrast between Totopos and Jaigádia chiefly stems from the differences of the rulers, resulting behavior of the subjects. As opposed to the angelic, semi-divine and self-restricting Queen Artemis, the ruler of Jaigádia is an absolutist despot who knows no limits to his rule. In the ensuing war, the Totoposian army wins an easy victory, as the soldiers of Jaigádia have no reason to protect their ruler. Yet the queen does not claim the throne, but a self-government is offered to the people of Jaigádia. The new liberty comes with problems, since the people are used to being ruled and cannot easily practice the opportunity of freedom. Sociability is on a very low level, as fear had permeated the country during the years of dictatorship. Streets were silent, people did not dare to talk to each other. Whereas, in Gregory Claeys's words, quote, the core of the ideal society is social relationships, not material plenty. Utopia's key goal has been greater unity, camaraderie, and friendship, by contrast to dystopias where fear and hatred of others predominate, and individual isolation and loneliness are deliberately promoted by rulers. This is exactly the case in Jaigádia. They are not used to expressing their thoughts freely, which is partly the reason of the fate of the ruler, as nobody dared to tell him that the Totoposian army is stronger than his. During the discussions of the future of Jaigádia, it is agreed that the best form of government is constitutional monarchy. A meeting of the common people is summoned to discuss the details of the new regime. But this meeting proves to be useless, as everyone only acknowledges their own material interests and wishes for such regulations that benefit themselves, without any sign of solidarity. As if they were manifesting the truth of George Orwell's Bon mot, who said that there is a difference between what the public is interested in and public interest. After the failure of the commons, the higher-ranking people later agreed that a king is needed. Otherwise, everyone wants to become a ruler. Finally, the king is elected with a council to limit his power, and it is also agreed that the members of the council have to be replaced regularly. In Tariményes, direct democracy is shown to lead into the chaos of self-interest, yet the regular discussions of social and political matters by noblemen is considered an element of healthy political structure. For Bessenyei, the best guarantee of freedom is the rule of an individual who is respectful of the laws. Now, let me shift to another important example of the negotiations of democratic ideals in 19th century Hungary, which is a far better known piece. That's The Tragedy of Man by Imre Madács. It was written in 1862, and it's the most often performed Hungarian play ever since it was first put on stage, and it's also been translated into 40 languages. The tragedy spells out the complex allegory of mankind's history through the adventures of the original couple Adam and Eve, traveling through space and time, visiting the most important instances of human history, such as ancient Egypt, Athens and Rome, or Prague in the 16th century, Paris during the French Revolution, a futuristic phalanstery, and so on, in 15 scenes rather than acts. The goal of this journey is a search for a suitable social and political framework for the autonomous human being. From the point of view of democratic ideals, the most relevant part where the shortcomings of a democratic political structure become apparent is the fifth scene that describes the death of Miltiades in ancient Athens. This part of the play is preceded by the scene in Egypt, where Adam, as the pharaoh, concludes that the despotic rule offers no option for a fruitful existence of people, not even for the pharaoh. The Society of Athens represents a response to the problem of the previous scene as an archetype of Western democracy with the sovereignty of the people. Yet the shortcomings of the rule of the masses are highlighted, and the scene ends in the tragic fall of the benevolent hero. The scene reflects on historical events without targeting a full accuracy around the return of Miltiades after an unsuccessful expedition against the Persians some years after the famous victory at Marathon. Athens at this time was a democracy in the ancient sense of the word. And now I'm obviously risking that Mir knows these things much better. Representative democracy in that the citizens were more directly involved in governing. Although full citizenship tended to be restricted in the Greek city-states with women, slaves, foreigners, and some others excluded. Mir just spoke about the concept of the demos in quite detail. The citizens were much more deeply enfranchised than in modern representative democracies because they were directly involved in governing, end of quote. In Madács's play, it is demonstrated that a formally democratic decision-making process in itself does not solve the problems of human communities. Economic inequalities, the lack of fraternity, corruption, and the inability of the uneducated people to see the long-term consequences of their decisions are lethal for the community. For instance, you may remember that Mir mentioned that Isocrates considered the Spartans more democratic because they were more equal, more democratic than the Athenians. In the play, common people are not mature enough for democratic decision-making, and leaders are demanded. It is also implicitly present in the drama that the exclusion of women from decision-making has negative consequences. The wife of Miltiades represents the qualities that are needed for conscious considerations of the impact of a decision. Common people in Athens are not autonomous. They only expect leaders to take advantage of the voting powers. As one of them complains, nobody has tried to buy my vote. Without some level of economic equality, or at least economic safety, people's votes do not represent their autonomous decisions, but the power of those who are able to control them. Beyond economic issues, the power of the media also appears in a basic form. Judgments are formed on the basis of hearsay and the rhetorical skills of the speakers. Interpretation of real events depends on the skills of orators and their ability to control public opinion by framing or withholding information. As Bernard Crick argues, quote, "The populist mode of democracy is a politics of arousal more than of reason," end of quote. The democratic system described in the Athens scene is not the decision-making process of a large number of independent people, but more the rule of the mob and those who can control the mob. Today, democracy is linked to concepts of autonomy, the rule of law, freedom of expression, and commitment to the common good. The concept of democracy the tragedy presents is more basic and chaotic and reflects problems around a natural constituent of democracy, the power of large groups of people, or as Ferenc Horansky mentioned, majority rule. As Gregory Claes opines in Dystopia Natural History, mass, crowd, and mob are emotive terms. They imply the more invidious aspect of collective association and identity: fury, violence, or lawlessness, irrationality, extreme emotionality, or uncontrolled movement, a proneness to delusion, and a pronounced susceptibility to manipulation. It is exactly in this meaning that mobs, masses, and crowds appear as negative forces in the tragedy, and to some extent also in Tariménes. The collective mind of the mob is weaker and is often seen as amoral compared to the potentially virtuous individual. The impulsiveness and intolerance of the masses call for a control by leaders, not only in political theory, but also on the stage. The dangers of the collective mind are depicted emphatically, and the demonization of the crowd also finds a powerful representation. In this respect, both Bessenyei's Tariménes and Madach's play foreshadows José Ortega y Gasset's notions in his The Revolt of the Masses from 1930 about the losses suffered by the accession of the masses to power, particularly the deterioration of the qualities associated with the nobility. There's the events in various other scenes of the tragedy, so later scenes, prompt that the ideal political establishment in 19th century Central Europe is not democracy, but the constitutional rule of an enlightened leader. Democracy remains a failed attempt in the tragedy, yet hope is not given up, as it never is in the play. In a later scene describing the terror of the French Revolution, Adams' conclusion is that despite the destruction, the revolution possessed a heavenly spark, and below the blood and mud, the ideal still shines, the ideal of the rule of people. While this is maintained, nowhere does the tragedy show a democratic pattern without serious flaws. As a conclusion, we can claim that the problems of democracy feature as an important and recurring topic in Hungarian utopian literature. 19th century works often presenting the rule of a benevolent monarch in a constitutional democracy as an ideal. Both Bessenyei's and Madach's text argue for the necessity of leadership. In Bessenyei, the rule of law as a limitation of power is very much emphasized. Now, I don't really want to link it necessarily to present-day issues, but the current rise in the 21st century in the cults of leaders has really complex reasons, including the social media. But as you could see, 19th century Hungarian text may also have some kind of indirect influence. At least there is a strong tradition of supporting powerful and presumably benevolent rulers. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Zsolt, for this thought-provoking and very interesting talk. Now we have our second speaker of the session, Iva Dimovska, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the CEU Democracy Institute, working on our topic, Utopian nationalism in the formation of socialist Yugoslavia. And the title of her talk today is Barbarians and Geniuses, or the Democratic Potentials of the Balkan Utopia. Yes, Iva, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you for coming to this workshop. So my PowerPoint is a bit less interesting than Zsolt, but it will serve mostly as a few examples of the art that I'm talking about and a few quotes at the end. So if you Google Utopia in Yugoslavia, you will see that there's so many results that come up, and at least in the last 20 years, there's been a number of scholarly but also popular literature pieces on the former Yugoslavia and the meaning of utopia. For example, this is a very prominent recent example. From the summer of 2018 to January 2019, an exhibition titled Toward a Concrete Utopia, Architecture in Yugoslavia from 1948 to 1980 could be visited at the MoMA Museum in New York. And as it was stated in the exhibition catalog, Toward a Concrete Utopia, Architecture in Yugoslavia introduces the exceptional work of socialist Yugoslavia's leading architects to an international audience for the first time, emphasizing the specific situatedness of Yugoslavia between the capitalist West and the socialist East. That prompted, this is an example of in the catalog, that prompted Yugoslavia's architects to respond to the contradictory demands and influences, developing a post-war architecture both in line with and distinct from the design approaches seen elsewhere in Europe and beyond. The architecture that emerged from international style skyscrapers to brutalist socialist buildings is a manifestation of the radical diversity, hybridity, and idealism that characterized the Yugoslav state itself. That was, in a sense, concludes this catalog, a utopian idea. This exhibition prompted a certain interest for a revitalization in the socialist past and its architecture in the region, with local artists and architects publishing opinion pieces and studies of the exhibition, and especially because it was staged in MoMA. And that seemed to be somewhat forgotten in the last 2 decades under pressures of blooming nationalist movements in the region, whose goal, among others, was the erasure of socialist past and its architectural and geographical heritage. So my project, similarly, is interested in the overlapping points between idealism, utopia, East-West, diversity, hybridity, and idealism in the former Yugoslavia. This thing that I'll try to present today with a short example in the end of a 1920s avant-garde practice in Yugoslavia is part of a larger project that is right now being developed here at the Democracy Institute. And this project will examine the connections between utopia and nationalism in the political, cultural, and artistic life of the former Yugoslavia. This establishment of the state that was firstly named the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes in 1918 was itself catalyzed, claim a lot of scholars, by a certain utopia, and that's the pan-Slavic idea. This claim, the formulation of the pan-Slavic idea as a utopian ideal, lies at the center of this interdisciplinary project, as it traces the multivalent roles of utopian expressions in literary, political, but also social texts. So here I am to show how this mission of establishing a political and social system based on the idea of shared pan-Slavic nationhood, while incorporating sometimes complementary but sometimes opposite processes of nation building in each of the Slavic nations, was at times a utopian, but at times a dystopian process. I established that there's 3 phases of development that are both temporally geographically determined when it comes to the relationship between nationalism and utopia, and they will be the main processes of this project. The first phase will trace the early manifestations and engagements with utopia and socialism through basically focusing on the tensions between the East and the West in the works of significant writers and movements from the 1920s, mostly from Belgrade and Zagreb. Then the second phase focuses on the post-war period from the 40s to the 60s, moving to the margins of Yugoslavia, multi-ethnic and multicultural territories that once belonged to former neighboring empires, such as Vojvodina, and then Kosovo will maybe be included here, as well as something that a territory in Italy that was for a very brief time part of Yugoslavia, Trieste. And the third and the final phase will outline the decline of this socialist utopian ideal by examining the proliferation of socialist dystopias as a new genre in Yugoslav writing from the 50s to the 80s. So these 3 phases are also very much connected, I should mention here, to the historical background, to the establishment of Yugoslavia. And what I'm following here is that, so there's a period from the 20s and the 30s that is especially, interested in this tension between the East and the West. But then as the war happens and after the first falling apart of Yugoslavia and basically the transition from the kingdom to what is later going to become the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, there seems to be a new history that develops here. So from the 40s, after the war, during a period of reconstruction, the Yugoslav Federation was built and reproduced on a discourse of victory, introducing a Soviet-type kind of administration, socialism, with its call to physical work, collectivism, anti-capitalism, and a 5-year economic plan. And this seemed to go on until 1948, when this period, Yugoslavia maintained a close relationship with the Soviet Union. However, in 1948, famously, Tito and Stalin had a dispute, and then Tito went into a conflict, and this is known as the breakup of the relationship with Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. So that emphasizes, in a political move that was meant to emphasize the political independence of Yugoslavia and the moving further from the Soviet influence and facing more to the West. The 60s and the 50s, for example, after this, are known mostly in scholarship as a more liberal and an open and decentralized political system. And this is where, compared, for example, to other Eastern European countries, Yugoslavia developed much more open relationships with the West at this point and with capitalism. And it had certain kind of semi-democracy. So this is a period that is mostly regarded as something of a third way, sometimes even third way utopianism between the East and the West in the history of Yugoslavia. However, this multicultural idea of brotherhood and unity that was basically the basis of this federation was very fragile, even at this point. And starting for the first time in the 70s, this whole basis started to crumble with protests in the 70s. And in 1974, famously, the constitution was changed to allow for more liberties that were seen to then go to granting more rights and independence to the Six Nations. And finally, during the 80s, there was a period of an increased economic crisis that finally ended up with the first democratic multi-party elections that were held in Yugoslavia in 1990, first in Croatia and Slovenia. And of course, after this, Yugoslavia falls apart. The breakup, the fall of the federation officially started in June 1991, and then ended in the Yugoslav wars. So what is interesting to me is this notion of imagining this idea of Yugoslavia as a pan-Slavic nation, as a utopian ideal, especially in this first and second phase from the 20s to the 60s, it seems to be, grounded in this idea of eradication of national differences between the six nations. And it seems that this historical idea in former Yugoslavia was that it was the unification of the Slavs that lived between the Adriatic Sea and the Black Sea, and that were in a way connected by a common language and culture. It was a political engineering project, and Yugoslavia, according to its engineers, promised to go beyond these contradictions of nationalism and ethnic groups. Socialist Yugoslavia was then created from 6 different nations or republics, and Titoism was imagined and founded on the assumption that economic and political homogenization will lead to the creation of a pure worker state. This is why a political culture that was composed of several nations within a federal state system process was founded by institutions that prevented the domination of one national group. And in essence, all Yugoslav had a Yugoslav federal supranational identity. And that was supposed to, they all, of course, had their own several individual identities, but that one supranational identity was supposed to eradicate. It was supposed to somehow be larger than their presumed separate national identities. But it seems that, as many scholars are especially arguing today, that this notion of the separate national identities always remained very vital and very crucial in the establishment and in the daily functioning life of the Yugoslav communities. For example, in an article called Scenes from the Last Yugoslav Generation, The Long March from Yugo-Utopia to Nationalism, Zala Volcic claims that there's there's always existed something like a Yugoslav imaginary, a Yugoslav culture, a supernatural Yugoslav identity, or Yugoslav mind that could be felt throughout the region. But at the same time, that didn't diminish the existence and the powerful existence of the daily differences between the nations in the daily functioning of in the country. So she basically, this article that I'm talking about, she did interviews with what she calls the last generation born from 65 to 1980 in Macedonia and in Slovenia, trying to see what are people's everyday experiences of how they basically how do they consider themselves, what kind of nation and what kind of ethnic group they belong to. So she says that in this last generation that basically was born in something that can be considered the good times in the middle of the 60s, when there was a lot of movement and semi-democratic freedoms, then until the 80s with the violent collapse of the federation, that there's a sense of kind of impossible, false utopian entity, emphasizing that this Yugoslav notion of brotherhood and unity was a project that was seen as a large-scale ideological discursive project whose goal was not exactly the creation of a real collective identity across the South Slavic lands, but the establishment of a political construction of an ideological utopia. So what is interesting here is this notion that utopia is something that is false, something that cannot be completely achieved, but at the same time, this is happening in the last few. And this is the experiences of people who definitely experienced the collapse of this federation. So, also one interesting thing that I found fascinating is that, for example, there's surveys of how people felt during all these phases that I'm talking about in Yugoslavia. In the beginning, after the World War, for example, there wasn't in the surveys or the census a category of Yugoslav. That was introduced in 1951. And at that point, only around 1.1% of the entire nation would declare themselves as Yugoslavs. And it was seen as a category in the surveys and in the census, it was seen as a category belonging to people who consider themselves like that are nationless, that for some reason they don't have a nation. And even in the best times, this number around the 60s and the 70s never reaches more than 6 to 10%. It varies throughout the republics, but the biggest number, of course, of people who would consider themselves Yugoslav is in the urban communities, in pan-cultural artistic communities. But all in all, there was always a sense of belonging to a specific nation. So in my project, and especially in the space that I'm dealing with now, I'm trying to see how basically what is the relevance of the idea of the nation and nationalism when we're talking about utopia in Yugoslavia. So one of the earliest, and in the last 5 minutes of this talk, I will talk about an example from the 1920s in Serbia and Croatia. One of the earliest and most influential artistic and political movements that was based on the concept of utopia in Yugoslavia was Zenitism, that was formed with the launching of the international magazine Zenit, first published in Zagreb from 1921 to 1923, and then in Belgrade from 1923 to 1926 by its main progenitor. This is the Serbian writer Ljubomir Mičić. So the journal gathered poets and writers from cities and cultural centers across from Yugoslavia, like Zagreb, Belgrade, Ljubljana, Sombor, Split, and Zemun, but it also established cooperation with Yugoslav writers living in abroad in the West, in Prague, Paris, and Vienna. Contributions from Russia and the West were also left mostly unprinted and untranslated, And a lot of the major European movements at that time, from the beginning of the 20th century, like Expressionism, Futurism, and Dada, were reflected in the journals. But Zenitism, as a movement, transcended its apparent artistic orientation precisely because of a utopian urge to initiate a new tradition of spirituality with something that Mičić called the universal human epoch, created through a new individual, one that would reach the zenith of human nature. This is a quote from the journal. This is the poster for the first magazine. The main personification of Mičić's utopian ideas was a revolutionary anarchistic figure of a man who he called Barbarian Genius. And he first appears in I'll find it now, in the manifesto of Zenitism in 1921, written by the same writer, and then also the poets Ivan Gol and Boško Tokin. So this idea of the figure of the Barbarian genius, he was imagined to be a modern, forceful, and an authentic Balkan man, who in the new age would Balkanize Europe. The new utopian society brought upon this man will offer new art, new culture, and a total re-evaluation of traditional values and political ideas, as Micic would say. Then it advances to face young Yugoslavia and announces its rebirth: new man, new spirit, new art. Micic did not share the idea of social stability under communism and socialism, and he longed for another revolution, sparked by this kind of a utopian impulse. The two parties that were in his imagined war were the Slavs and the Latins, with the Slavs represented as the new barbarians who had arrived to revolutionize the civilization, the old civilization of Europe. The result of this conflict was something that would concern the whole humankind, and that will eventually liberate the East and the West, the Slavs and the Latins. And this is, according to him, a utopian Zenitist project that functions as a synthesis in which Western rationalism is the thesis and Balkan spiritualism is the antithesis. The goal is not the destruction, as he says, of the European civilization and its values, but its rejuvenation through fertilization with the healthy barbarian blood of young Yugoslavia. So it's undeniable, as you can see, that Zenitism uses and further solidifies this Orientalist, nationalist, and racist trope, as Micic equates the West with excessive rationality, capitalist economy, and formalism, and what he calls the Southeast is an embodiment of barbarian purity, good-heartedness, and Balkan male virility. That is, and here's a couple of quotes, that is unspoiled by the perverse culture of Baudelaire keepers and coffee house decadents, heirs of Baudelaire, and European degenerates. So he proudly takes on this trace of Western Orientalism and turns it upside down, making Western Europe culture the object of inquiry and exalting in the same sense of historical inevitability, which the West usually ascribes to the East and to the Balkan histories. It was starting from, for example, Maria Todorova's foundational study, Imagining the Balkans. In the last few decades, we've seen a lot of the proliferation of important scholarly literature that belongs under the category of Balkanism or Balkan studies that critically reinvestigates how popular Balkan discourses posit as an ontological difference between a European self and a Balkan other. But it's evident that as early as in the 20s, Micic and his followers were aware of this dualism, and they incorporated into their artwork and Utopian manifesto in various ways throughout these different phases of Zenitism. Micic coined the term Barbarian genius, wanting to indicate a specific Balkan creative energy, and used it to refer to the Slavs in general and to the people of the Balkans in particular. In his early uses, interestingly, the term barbarian sometimes carried negative connotations. But as he was lamenting against the poor cultural heritage in the Balkans, he refused to be a barbarian. He refused to be a barbarian slave who died for the freedom of his race. But then he declared himself first a Zenitist, replacing the barbarian with Zenitist, and only later, as the terms primitivism and barbarism appeared in the works of the poets he was collaborating with in the early years of this movement, and that they were reappropriated as signifiers of initiation, aptitude, and creation, the Barbarian genius was reclaimed and vindicated in this new role. Zenitism is both a Yugoslav and a Balkan utopian movement, and then it embodies this particular ambiguity that we're talking about here, this ambiguity and the duality between Eastern and Western, Central and Eastern, civilized and barbarian, and the European self, and the Balkan, the barbarian other. Micic wants to, and as a conclusion, I will just say, because I have 1 minute, Micic wants to remind us that these concepts, such as Europe and the West, with this work, are equally contestable tropes that convey historically and contextually differentiating meanings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iva, for your talk. And now we have our last speaker of today, Maria Spariosu, who is a PhD candidate in our final year at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, at the Department of History and Civilization. And the title of her talk today is The Only Real Democracy is Direct Democracy, an exploration of the concept of democracy into Italian contemporary utopian communities. Yes, Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Emre. So first, I would like to thank Zsolt, Iva, and Darina for organizing this conference, which has been very fruitful so far. So I think, I'll be going full loop and turning back to Professor Luisa Passerini's talk this morning. So I'll be turning back to the issue of the 1960s and 70s and the 80s in Italy. And this presentation is based on what was originally a chapter in my dissertation that I reworked for the purpose of this conference. And the chapter initially addressed the kinds of politics practiced in 3 contemporary utopian communities, but I have now slightly reworked it to address the concept of democracy envisioned in 2 Italian contemporary communities, and it's therefore still a work in progress. So the 2 intentional communities at the center of this presentation are La Comunità Bagnaia, a political commune located outside of Siena, and Damanhur, a spiritual community located 50 kilometers north of Torino. The material regarding each of these communities resulted from my PhD research and a series of oral history interviews and participant observation that I conducted in 2019 in each of these communities. And I will first briefly linger on a definition of intentional communities or utopian communities, followed by a discussion of the historical context out of which these 2 communities surfaced. And finally, I will discuss community members' conceptualization of what they call real democracy, so the title of this presentation, and as well as direct democracy, in relation to their organization and practices. So a definition of utopian communities or intentional communities. They've been defined in a myriad of ways, but the issue with most of these definitions is that they are narrow at the expense of not fully encapsulating the diverse manifestations of these communities. I won't go into the various definitions, but suffice it to say that many either limit what counts as a utopian community by limiting the size of the community or the degree of sharing, so often requiring their members to share living accommodation, property, resources, and so on, which is not always the case. So therefore, I've opted for the following definition by Lemmentower Sargent, which delineates some boundaries, but is less specific in order not to discount the various manifestations that intentional communities can take. So a group of 5 or more adults and their children, if any, who come from more than one nuclear family and who have chosen to live together to enhance their shared values or for some other mutually agreed upon purpose. Furthermore, I would just like to make a note regarding Rosa Beth Cantermont's identification of 3 kinds of critiques of society that have provided initial impulse for the utopian searching community, which may be useful in the discussion of our community's conceptualization of democracy that will follow. So these 3 critiques fueling the utopian impulse in community have been, firstly, religious, referring to the 16th and 18th century experiments that sought closer contact with God and also with one another. Secondly, a politico-economic critique, which was born out of the increasing dislocation, mechanization, overcrowding, and poverty that resulted from the Industrial Revolution, and mostly sought refuge from the evils of the factory system in small socialist communities. And 3, a psychosocial critique, focusing on the psychosocial consequences of modern society, namely social isolation and inner fragmentation. And I want to place a special emphasis on this 3rd category that comes to fruition in the 1960s and 70s and holds that modern society has put people out of touch with their innate nature and seeks to create liberating situations conducive to intimacy and psychological health. And I want to place special emphasis on this because today's communities can be seen, the ones in my presentation, of course, can be seen as an extension of the 3rd category because of their emphasis on self-development and self-growth. And the characteristics of this 3rd category, focus on the inner emotional world, have determined both the nature of these contemporary utopian communities as well as their conceptualizations of democracy. So just a brief historical context, which we actually already discussed with Professor Luisa Passerini this morning. So I'll try to make it a bit shorter, But yeah, so the acute historical conditions of the 1960s and 70s student movements in Italy, let's see. Well, let me summarize it a bit more. So as in other countries in the same period, in the 1960s and 70s, Italy essentially experienced an anti-authoritarian revolt, demanding more democratic decision-making, rejecting over-bureaucratization, and aiming for a more humanist understanding of politics. This period also privileged the expression of emotions as a form of revolt against the status quo, as well as values like reason, order, and discipline. And initially led by students who took to the streets in 1966, this wave of protests attracted workers in 1969 and formed what became known as the extra-parliamentary left movement. What this movement sought was to implement an internationalist communist vision in the country. However, in the late 1970s, a period of heightened violence led by left-wing terrorist groups resulted in a deep rift within the extra-parliamentary left movement, which became divided into those who believed that violence was justified only in situations of self-defense, and those who believed that armed struggle was necessary to overthrow the regime. And this brings us to the decisions. So the decision of community members to join their respective communities. So these members rejected the violence experience on the outside during this period. So they were part of this second group that rejected violence as a means for enacting societal revolution. So now I have quotes from my narrators. And I just want to make a note that the community members from Damanhur, their names are in Italian. They're named after, they have animal and plant names. So Volpe means fox. And I would just, so Volpe from Damanhur, he explained that he was part of the leftist extra-parliamentary group, Lotta Continua, Continuous Struggle, another far-left militant organization in the 1970s. And he said, so I kind of joined because it was fashionable, it was in style, and you kind of felt like you were somebody on the inside of this group. But they also used extreme methods because they used violence like raids, strong actions, and burning here and smashing over there. I didn't want to do things with violence. Volpe quickly turned inwards, in quotes, and joined a Buddhist community of Pomaya outside of Pisa, which is still operative today. And later he joined Damanhur. And about the decision to join a utopian community in this context that I just described, in the heightened violence in the 70s, another member from La Comunità di Bagnaia puts it quite succinctly. He says, for me, I think, and for several others, it is a way to make a difference and try to make a difference in the wider culture without having to battle people all the time. A more peaceful way of trying to make change instead of combative. And as we will see, these emotional reactions to the events of the time shaped how members subsequently conceptualized democracy. And now I reached the conceptions of democracy in the two communities, which advocated for a kind of community democracy, democracy in protest of liberal democracy, which they essentially viewed as not functioning. So in effect, Cikala, a member of Damanhur, described the intermediary institutions of liberal democracies, like voting, politicians, political parties, and so on in the following way. She says, I think that politics and politicians and so on, they're all maneuver. It's not real. What we live and what we see is not real. And so I prefer to think about the things that I see, that I touch. Instead, Cikala gestured towards what she saw as a different kind of politics that was practiced in Damanhur. She said, here politics is smiling and talking with somebody. Here politics is drinking coffee and asking someone how they are and talking about their things. In the same vein, a member of La Comune di Bagnaia expressed, I believe more at this point in the politics of little things, in the politics of personal change, the relationships between people, and education, which is also political. And in this way, members point to a bottom-up approach to politics in which their everyday forms of relating constitute political action. And this bottom-up approach to politics extends to their conceptualization of democracy, which can be practiced in day-to-day interactions, and which they find more concrete and meaningful as a result. And their version of a bottom-up democracy takes the shape of a consensual democracy based on the reasoned dialogue between all members of a community. And this is specifically the case for La Comune di Bagnaia, but it's also valid for Damanhur to some degree, as we'll see. So in La Comune di Bagnaia, in an ideal and consensual and direct democracy, everyone participates in the final decision and no one is excluded, reinforcing solidarity amongst everyone, a principle which the commune's very existence is formulated upon and which is also contained in their constitution. Central to the perception of real democracy is the incorporation of as many viewpoints as possible, as well as striving to understand the other's view more deeply, even if you do not agree with it at first. So theoretically, the consensus approach sees the value in every opinion and strives to cultivate an awareness to notice and give voice to the whole field in which we are living in and its parts. It should be noted, however, that all members of the commune were of the left. And as one member, Franco, expressed, the beautiful thing about living together with so many is that I don't have to live with people who are voting for the right. Therefore, consensual decision-making was only possible in this case thanks to a shared value base. So consensus decision-making was put into practice, particularly during the commune's weekly meetings, during which they would vote on issues like whether to purchase a new car or to allocate funds for a member's child to go to college. And equally important was discussing emotions, perceptions, and conflicts. And when members need to decide on something, a vote is held, and every single member, 13 members at the time I was there, had to agree. If someone disagrees, the conversation continues until the voting eventually takes place again. And in some cases, voting on a decision remained frozen. That is, it was left to one side because unanimity could not be found. And rather than imposing a quantifiable majority, members believed that through dialogue, one would always be able to approach a reasoned consensus. And members emphasized, however, that a specific kind of dialogue was needed, one that oozed for them what they viewed as the ideal democratic values. So members explained that their dialogue followed the principles of Jerome Lee's Ecological Communication. And Lees is a psychotherapist, former professor of psychology at the University of Harvard, and he's an author of various books like Deep Listening and Ecological Communication. And he had been to this community and held workshops on the topic of ecological communication. And as I understood it from speaking with members, ecological communication involves the application of ecological principles to human relationships. So cultivating each person's resources, respecting diversity, and at the same time maintaining global cohesion so that people can work together towards a common goal. This method devised by Lees attempts to find a balance between individual needs and the growth of the whole. And in particular, the fundamental methodologies for democratic communication in the group, according to Lees, include firstly, constructive criticism, so asking permission to talk about an issue, being as concrete as possible, describing one's feelings, clarifying the reasons for your suggestions. And secondly, another important methodology was facilitation. So having someone or several people to help avoid monopolization, encouraging inactive members to join, using positive reasoning. And therefore, one of the main points in ecological or democratic communication is that the authoritarian control of a single leader is badly suited to complex situations. In a mutual participation group, on the other hand, feedback is offered by whoever is involved in the decision, so those who put into practice and those who receive its impact. Amy from La Comune di Bagnaia explained that she had had issues taking part in party politics when she lived on the outside of the community, as well as politics at her previous university job, because she had issues with the undemocratic, according to her, and competitive communication that took place there. She explained that she found communication in La Comune di Bagnaia very different from the one she experienced on the outside. And she said that at her university meetings, I'd get intolerant and frustrated how people didn't listen to each other in the meetings. So the school that we follow in La Comune di Bagnaia, ecological communication, means that we don't interrupt each other, we listen. And she says, I guess very basic things about how to talk to each other and make decisions together. But in the outside world, it's not like that. In addition to the use of ecological language, to create better dynamics in the group, and thus also in decision-making, La Comune di Bagnaia also hired Jenny, who was a mediator specialized in group dynamics, who visited the community a couple of times per year. And she said, so Jenny, because consensus requires trust and openness, according to her, so unlike parliamentary democracy, which tends to assume conflict and competition, Jenny played an essential role in cultivating the trust so central to the consensus decision-making process. So she helped the community essentially to work through tensions and emotional blockages that existed between members and on certain topics so that members could feel more trusting and then consequently push through blockages in decision-making. So for example, when I visited the commune in 2019, as is the case in many intentional communities, the younger and older generations were particularly tense towards one another, and this reverberated into their consensus decision-making. So Jenny's mediation, in turn, was aimed to help the generations understand each other better and therefore eventually facilitate further unity and more democratic decision-making. So while Banyaya employed consensus decision-making as its only decision-making method, Damanhur could not, due to its size of 600 members. So in Damanhur, consensus was practiced only at the level of the nucleo, which is a specific term used in the community to refer to one's home. And it's usually made up of 8 to 25 people living in the same household and sharing a common space. And then beyond the level of the nucleo, Damanhur employed a kind of representative democracy, but with different characteristics to the mainstream representative democracy. And the difference between Damanhur's representative democracy and the mainstream one resides in the difference between electing delegates and trustees, with delegates following the express preferences of their constituents, and trustees, for these delegates, the main thing I would like to remark is that there's very little room to maneuver from what the population wants, versus trustees, who are representatives that follow their own understanding of the best action to pursue. And in Damanhur, those taking on political roles acted as delegates. And they were elected by the population using a majority system, but they had to follow closely what the population expressed during citizen-wide assemblies that took place once per week. And if delegates were perceived as straying away from the population's expressed desires, the Court of Justice, a neutral body, could be consulted to evaluate the situation and reprimand or replace the delegate if necessary. So Damanhur also employed methods of nonviolent communication, which were also contained. They're also contained in their constitution, and they strove to include as many voices in the decision-making process as possible. Also, thanks to the various channels that existed in the community to be able to do so. So, for example, there were weekly community-wide assemblies, weekly nucleo meetings, so at the level of the household. There are also something called le serate, called the evenings, if I translate it into English, which were meetings once per week where the community philosophy was discussed and also updated. There were also referendums, and there was also a community newspaper where all members of the community could publish their opinion on various happenings. So there was no restriction to any of the members to express complaints and so on through these channels. It should be noted that in the case of La Comunidad Banyaya, so as in the case of La Comunidad Banyaya, the spiritual practices and various community organs that existed in Damanhur acted as a control mechanism, so to help unify members' ideological tendencies. So making decision-making easier than it would have been the case outside of the community setting. And I just want to make a parallel between Banyaya and Damanhur's conceptualization of democracy and deep democracy, which is a concept developed by Arnold Mindel, a physicist and Jungian analyst in 1988. And according to Mindel, deep democracy, as opposed to classical democracy, which focuses on majority rule, refers to an attitude which focuses on the awareness of voices that are both central and marginal. And furthermore, deep democracy operates on the premise that allowing oneself to take seriously seemingly unimportant events and feelings can often bring unexpected solutions to both group and inner conflicts. As Mindel posited, deep democracy can manifest in a subtle and powerful way when someone is able to express the very essence of what he or she is feeling, whether doing group interactions, political dialogue, or personal relationships. It is often the case, he argued, that when someone gets to the essence of an experience and the community's tensions, it is often possible to facilitate tremendous unplanned change, bringing everyone in the room to a common ground of human suffering, which then serves for deeper understanding and working together towards sustainable change. And it was in this deeper form of dialogue that members of our communities, contemporary utopian communities, believed it is possible to achieve consensus and put into practice what they called real democracy. And while members were generally satisfied with their respective forms of governance and decision-making, as well as nonviolent communication, they also pointed out some of the drawbacks. So for instance, Ruth pointed out that while the structure of Banyaya was designed according to the belief that members were all equal, in her view, there were still situational hierarchies, as she named them, connected to who possessed more knowledge on a certain topic. So when I asked her if she could explain what she meant by these hierarchies, she said maybe the sense of, which opinion is more valid who the others think is more capable of understanding what the best solution is, or who is professional. I would like to note a remark by Rhiannon Firth. She's a scholar of intentional communities, who argues that many, if not all, communities encounter issues whereby some individuals dominate certain situations and unintentional hierarchies arise, often based on gender, education, longevity in the group, and confidence. And while this may happen everywhere in everyday life, Firth notes that the distinction lies in that there is arguably more reflexivity about this in intentional communities who make a point of discussing these matters and trying to right them. And I would add that this reflexivity also on the part of members is further consolidated due to the many organizational structures created to suppress these hierarchies, like the citizen-wide assemblies or meetings with facilitators for ecological communication in the case of both of our communities.
Anna Maria.
2 minutes, okay. So I think I'll cut to the chase, but well, as a last remark of a drawback of consensus deep democracy, someone also remarked that there were many impasses in consensus reaching because of he explained that it gets very tiring to represent everybody, and sometimes it can take years to make a decision. So for something like expanding, because one of the communities wanted to expand and incorporate new members, they hadn't been able to reach an agreement on this in over 10 years. So to conclude, Damanhur and Banyaya practiced a kind of ideal democracy which differed from liberal democracy, in that obligation towards the community was prioritized over individual rights, and the realization of a common good was fulfilled by procedures and forms of political life that assured the equal participation of everyone. And in the consensual democracy practice in Banyaya, it is important to constantly exercise self-awareness and awareness more generally regarding one's method of communication in the decision-making process. And it is therefore in the kind of dialogue that democracy can be achieved. This form of direct democracy remains ideal in that it can only function in small-scale communities where members can directly communicate with one another and gather face-to-face at any moment to reach rational agreements. When these local limits are exceeded, direct democracy is no longer possible, and forms of representative democracy are needed, as in the case of Damanhur. However, even in the case of Damanhur, it was still possible to have a more representative approach than in traditional liberal democracies, with the nomination of delegates, as I explained, to represent citizens' desires directly, rather than trustees. Finally, while Franco's statement, which was in the title of my presentation, so the only real democracy is direct democracy, remains complex to implement outside his microcosm, I view the communities in this presentation as exemplary of the radical activism required for movement towards further human progress in the domain of democracy. And examples like Comune di Banyaya and Damanhur can remind us of those forms of democracy, and therefore societies that negate exclusion, where everyone's idea has a place and is a subject of consideration. And further research could focus on how to apply these community values and adapt them to our modern societies, which would imply invoking a Republican mentality over a liberal one, and that subordinates personal interest to the interests of society as a whole. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria. If we can have all the three speakers here now for the Q&A session, that would be great. Iva? And I think for the online audience, like if they have questions or comments, they could post on social media, I think, or on YouTube, and then we can just read them out. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So now I open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. Please feel free to ask the questions or make comments. Do we have any questions, comments? Zsolt?
Story. The irony of the story is the idea well after my parent, she was actually absolutely Spanish. She governed for 15 years or so without consulting the diet in Hungarian parliament. So it's very funny in some sense, an example of how to govern in the south. I guess she was not something that in real life, but this is just
It's an absolutely relevant comment. Actually, there's a number of ways in which the fictional Queen Artemish is similar to Maria Theresa, and a number of ways in which she's different. So they're not equal. There's been an attempt to look at this book, which actually I brought here. So it's more than 500 pages. I just checked, closer to 600. That it is a roman clave, so a key novel where you can have various kinds of persons. For instance, the King of Prussia could be this land of sorrows, and so on and so forth. but I think that's a huge exaggeration. There seem to be real life models, but the fictional equivalents are different. For instance, it's emphasized that Artemish is a national queen. That's a nation as a basis of the community is something really emphasized here. This is one of the reasons why she doesn't want to become the queen of Iougadia, because she could not be a good queen of a different nation. This is obviously a very significant difference from Maria Theresa, but otherwise it's mentioned that the description of the place is parallel to the Schönbrunn castle and park, and also in some other details are clearly established the similarity.
Thank you very much. I think we have another question from Greg, and then later.
I have brief questions for each of the papers, or for all three, rather. So, first of all, is there a sense in Hungary in this period of writing in the context of a common European utopian tradition, starting with more in Latin, obviously, but progressing through? I don't know if Phenomenos Telemachus is translated into Hungarian. It certainly was translated into German, which was well known to your authors. And it's published in 1699, treatment work. It's one of the best-selling works of its time. And probably it's fair to describe it as a paradigmatic utopia for the whole of Europe. The influence of Britain is very profound as well. So let me give all three questions at once, and then I can stop. So, Eva, I wonder about this phrase, healthy barbarism. It's really interesting, the juxtaposition of civilization and also Western civilization. And I wonder what the etymology is here. I mean, what does barbarism mean in this context? Does it have a specific nationalist sense? Does it have a historical pedigree? Are there, is this resistance already against Roman occupation or whatever? And Anna, I was very interested in Jerome Liss, about whom I know absolutely nothing whatsoever. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about what the sources of his ideas are.
So, Anna, Maria, would you like to start first?
Yes. So I also don't know too much about him because it's a very new. I just started looking into this concept of ecological communication now for this presentation, but I know that he's a psychotherapist, and I believe he was influenced by this rejection of traditional psychotherapy that took place in the 60s and 70s. He's American, and I know that he was also he practiced, I think, Gestalt therapy. So, which was also very much about this. What happened in this transition from traditional psychotherapy to more alternative forms was a rejection of basically the conventional norms at the time, which had to do with some of these ideas about rationality and productivity and these what I discussed slightly in my presentation. And this Gestalt therapy, which probably you know about, but it was about turning inwards towards one's emotions and giving prevalence to this. Instead of outside factors and norms and forms of societal conventions. So this is all I can say at the moment, but thank you.
Eva?
Yeah, thank you so much for the. So yeah, you have a point. It's a very interesting juxtaposition of the healthy barbarian. From my research so far, I think it's well, there's this centuries-long, of course, opposition between the civilized and the barbarian, and I think this is what Micic is getting at there, and with this movement. But he has a lot of those tropes and vocabulary of the disgusting, decadent Europeans, and I think this is somewhere, from the 19th century onwards, and especially, it culminates in this modernism in Europe with Baudelaire and all of this urban dandy movement. So his way is like a complete opposition to that, saying you saw that quote, rejuvenation with the blood of a healthy barbarianism, and we're supposed to, the Balkan barbarian figure is supposed to somehow re-establish a different kind of modernism. And in this phase that I'm interested in, I'm still at the beginning of this research. It has a certain playful element, so I don't think it's that kind of serious in the 20s. Sadly, after he's expelled at some point, the magazine shuts down. I didn't say that in 1926, and then he goes to Paris in 38, and there publishes another novel based on this, and then it becomes ultra-nationalistic. So that kind of sense, I think there it's a more serious, although I still haven't read the novel. It's published in French and then translated into Serbian. But in this phase, it's really supposed to emphasize that difference between you degenerate, and especially in this sexual manner, you degenerate perverts, and there's a lot of Marquis de Sade in there, and this kind of, disgust towards the Europeans, and something that we're a different kind of, healthy in blood, but in a way that is gonna emphasize the healthiness and not so much a different kind of blood, is what I'm still reading on that. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Fenelon's Telemachus is a very important writing for Tarimenes, for Bessenyei. He certainly read it, and it was an important influence. Otherwise, in the Hungarian tradition, what I mentioned, that this is the first proper utopia written by a Hungarian, because other people in Hungary wrote utopias, like Jacobus Paleologus, a person of Greek origin who lived in Transylvania for some years, wrote something which can be considered as a utopia, or Johannes Comenius or Jan Kamensky, who also lived in Hungary for a while. He is also a kind of utopian or quasi-utopian writer, and More was important for Hungary. There was a person called Czigányik who wrote a Latin piece in which a fictional Thomas More is giving political advice to the king or the prospective king. But that is a reflection on Thomas More, but it doesn't have too much to do with utopia. So the closest we get to traditional classical utopianism is Bessenyei, but it's already within the Enlightenment context and in a much more playful and ironical than Thomas More.
Thank you very much. First, we will have the question from Balázs, and then I've seen that Luisa Pasirin has another question, so you'll go first, Balázs, and then Luisa, and then I'll come there. Okay, it's okay.
Yeah, I also have kind of short questions to all of you, to Zsolt, that I was I'm sure it was because of temporal limitation also, but I was surprised that you didn't go into the other engagement of Mladáč with utopian kind of context or literary tradition, and that's the Phalansters,
yes, sure.
Which is a parody, of course, of Fourier. And that is also very interesting in the sense of how he's subverting it. And of course, there the point is that he reads it completely anti-democratically. Yes, I mean, like that there is no democracy in Utopia, and that's I think also an interesting element of the whole story. And maybe it would be interesting if you would reflect to what extent he is actually engaging with this. And to Iva, I was again thinking that if you want to kind of contextualize this, then you have to go beyond 1918 backwards, because of course you have this Yugoslav integral nationalist project, which is actually connected to a kind of utopian tradition. I mean, and there is also a kind of cultural projection there, of course. I mean, by default, because it's a kind of radical nationalism that is projecting some sort of national unity, but also even in the kind of stylistic literary genre, it's important. I mean, if you take Mitrinovic, I mean, he will be then the author for New Age in the 20s and all that. Yeah. So I mean, it would be interesting to kind of take this whole discussion more into account, and then I think it would lead you to something that is to a certain extent tricky, because then basically this is an anti-modernist project. Yes? I mean, and then it's not by chance that the guy will go into radical nationalism in the 30s. Yes, I mean, it's by nature. I mean, like it's exactly this trope of vitality, masculine vitality of the Balkans, the Dinaric discourse. This is like Twitch discourse, and this is actually, of course, there in the kind of like, let's say, peacemaking Yugoslavist discourse, but there is also an option in it to kind of subvert it and kind of use it as a kind of alternative futurism, yes, but the kind of like retro futurism in a way. So I mean, it's utopian, but it's kind of also anti-modernist, and that this tension I think would be interesting to somehow show. And I think a little bit similar question also to Anna Maria, because I knew a little bit about Damahur, I didn't know anything about the other one, but I mean there I always believed, and I mean now I checked it, and it looks like that it's very much, of course, connected to Steinerian tradition, yes, so like basically to anthroposophic tradition, and there, of course, even the aesthetics, the building and whatever, and there I think it would be interesting to see to what extent these communal structures that you are describing are actually embedded in this kind of 1970s alternative psycho whatever thing, or it is embedded in pre-existing traditions of this kind of, let's say, alternative spiritual community building. Is there analogy between, let's say, theosophist or anthroposophist tradition, communal organization, like their way of kind of sorting out internal discussions, delegates? I mean, are they having also citizens A and citizens B in the Swiss village where Steinerians are actually having their own kind of community or not? So I mean, basically, to what extent what you describe is rooted in this kind of 70s post-68 counterculture, and to what extent it's rooted in spiritualistic tradition. And if the spiritualistic tradition is stronger than it seems, then couldn't we create a stronger bridge between modality 1, that is religious community, and modality 3, that you describe as this kind of countercultural, whatever, psychological thing? So like, what is the continuity and discontinuity?
Thank you. Let's start with Zsolt this time.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. The phalanstery is one of the most interesting scenes of the tragedy, and today I wanted to have compare and contrast two different utopias, just to see that this issue is very strongly within the Hungarian tradition, and there are two very different generations, and still the attitude towards democracy is quite similar. Now, the phalanstery, you said, indeed, Fourier also calls his idea phalanstery, but what Madách describes as much closer to the Saint-Simonian ideal. And actually, Fourier emphasizes the importance of the emotive wellness of living in the phalanstery, whereas this is what is ridiculed in Madách. This is the place where Michelangelo is forced to carve identical legs for chairs, and everybody has to do something very simple job for the betterment of society. So it's a technological and very much totalitarian dystopia, where decision making is done by a couple of elders who are really very despotic in the name of science, of course. So they make very sophisticated decisions and seemingly scientifically supported, but absolutely anti-humanistic. So this was actually called a proto-dystopia by critics. So before the 20th century dystopian tradition in literature began, this we already have it in the stage.
Eva?
Yeah, thank you. Of course, I think that I have these three phases now that seem, solidified, but of course, it's not going to be. I'm also thinking about, okay, not in my personal research more now, even from after the 90s and not so much pre-1918, but you're right. And definitely about your other comment, it is very anti-modernist and it's very expected. I was trying to say that there's something in the first phase, as I see it in him, that I would separate this into, and then you can also think about this relationship between nationalism and democracy and what it is, depending on the phases of this artistic movement. In the first phase of the Zenithism, you can even think about something like quasi-democratic aspirations with Micic, because he has this kind of things of not satisfied with socialism, there should be another revolution, and it's very, then the nationalism is there, but I see it as a very humoristic attempt at doing something, and then it really escalates in this other post-30s phase, and it's definitely before the World War, so it's an ambiguous modernist project for sure, but you're right, I mean, I would be also I think that I would have to include something for the pre-1918 phases on how that also relates to the rise of nationalism, but I'm going to go ahead to Ana Maria.
Well, I don't have too much to say about it, because thank you for the comment, because I think this would be somehow the next steps also, so to deepen in a way with this, and definitely Damanhur is influenced by Steiner for sure. So the leader of Damanhur, Falco Tarasaco, who died in 2013, he was part of these esoteric circles in Turin during the 60s and 70s, and so I know that he also incorporated aspects of Steiner's philosophy into the community philosophy, which is very eclectic. So it would be very interesting to look also at how communities, theosophical communities also, conducted decision making, and see if there's any similarity there. And also because of the, I would say, I noticed in Damanhur both this influence of the counterculture, but also this spiritualistic traditions, as you mentioned, and I only had time to go into the very surface levels of it. But it's there, and maybe this also has to do with New Age spirituality as well. So this very eclectic hodgepodge, of nature of New Age spirituality, which seems to be, which seem to me influenced by both of these things that you mentioned. So definitely that would be a next step to take, and thank you for pointing that out. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Luisa Passerini.
Thank you.
From our online, yes.
Thank you. Yes, I am very interested in some of the aspects about gender, which have been mentioned more or less implicitly or explicitly in the three talks. In the Damanhur utopian community, what is the real situation of the democracy between women and men? A very simple question, but I remember information and references about how Damanhur was run some years ago, not right now. And in those reports, it seemed that women had a lower degree of democratic freedom and possibility of talking and expressing themselves, and also on the question of their bodies, how they would go around and would go through certain specificity of women's life, women's bodies, so the menarche, the menopause, and so on. So I would be very interested in knowing something about this. And for what concerns Iva, actually, there is a very interesting aspect of masculinity that comes out. And that's really, something that gender studies sometimes have not yet taken sufficiently into consideration. But it seems to me absolutely interesting that this authentic Balkan man is an imaginary which really, I think, would be worthwhile to explore. And finally, these queens, some imaginary and some real, so to say, which sort of torsion does power have in being embodied in a feminine queen, in a feminine leader, as actually I realize that it's not any sort of leader, it's a specific leader, it's a queen. A queen has a charge of perhaps utopianism in it. So I think that these aspects of your talks are very inspiring. And I would be grateful if you tried to say some more about these aspects. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Luisa, for your questions. I think we can start with Iva this time.
Thank you. It's a good strategy. Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, definitely. And as it was already said, no, masculinity and this idea of the barbaric man, it's always a man. And I think that when you read it in original, it's funny because it's supposed to be, it's a human, but at the same time, there's not even the illusion that there's supposed to be a female energy or anything included in this figure, in this trope of the Balkan authentic man. It's a masculine figure, and I agree. Like this part will definitely that will definitely be a part of this research, this chapter that I'm writing. And then, interestingly, I would also say that here the reception is important because around this group of Semitism, there's a couple of women also working in Hungary and in Serbia around this. And I think a couple of them have reactions to this trope of how can we have utopia and what kind of energy is this without anything female. So I'm like looking into some poets that are working in those circles, but it will definitely be a part of that. Thank you.
Anna Maria?
Yes, thank you. So thank you for your question, Lisa. So the question of gender roles in Damanhur. So I asked members, this was one of my questions that I asked during the oral history interviews. I asked women whether they felt there was gender equality in the community, and also men as well. And most of them answered that in their view there was. I remember one narrator in particular, her name was Gato, and she said that I think she was also part of some feminist collectives during the 60s and 70s, but she was saying that in her view, there were not these differences in gender equality, and it was up to you how you wanted to comport yourself in the community. And then the thing is that I didn't have a chance to ask people, for example, to the extent of the democratic decision making, so the citizen-wide assemblies, if there were issues that, for example, men, were speaking more often than women, or if women felt there was a kind of inequality there. I didn't have a chance to go so deeply into this. But yeah, in general, the idea, I think also in line with this new age spirituality, which is very much focused on the individual and this, the person's subjectivity and how somehow what they want to realize in this life, it's all up to them. So somehow the individual is the new God. When I would ask them this question about gender equality, they would also say it's up to you how you want to comport yourself and how to create things. So this was usually the response that I got. Then there was a division, though, I would say, in terms of gender roles when it came to the spiritual practices in the community. So a lot of the spiritual practices, for example, there was a ceremony every month when it was the full moon, and women were in charge of this ceremony in particular because it was associated with reproductive elements and so on. And so there was a division in this sense, in the spiritual realm. This is mostly what I can say about it. I know that there was also a huge change in the community in 2013 when Falco passed away. So they described that actually before 2013, the decision making, they hadn't tried out consensus decision making yet. And now when I spoke to them in 2019, they had said that they were trying to invert the pyramid. So I'm not sure how also this influenced gender equality also in the community, the citizen-wide assemblies and things like this. So
thank you. Zsolt?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. In Parimenes, Queen Artemis is an emphatically feminine queen. She is described even in erotic terms, sometimes wearing transparent clothes. If anybody wanted to make a movie out of this, that'd probably be a very interesting scene. At the same time, angelic and to some extent superhuman. This femininity, nevertheless, is not combined with maternity, so she doesn't have children, unlike Maria Theresa, for instance, who had a lot of children. And it's very much in contrast with the very masculine and despotic aspect of Buzorkan, the despot, the opposing king, and who criticizes Artemis, saying that she does not rule over her people, but she serves them. Quite clearly, that is being one of the core of the political message, that is actually the role of the ruler. So this masculinity and femininity, in somewhat stereotypical ways, is very strongly present in Beshenyi's book. As far as very shortly, I'd like to talk about Madách as well, where Eve is again, to some extent, in a stereotypical manner, a very important female power in the world. So whereas Adam is the rational, and Adam is always trying to find out new ways, that always leads to disasters, new and new disasters. And the natural and emotive and very powerful aspect of Eve is one that keeps saving humanity all the time. And in the Athenian scene, she is the wife of Miltiades, who has common sense and an understanding of the situation, whereas all the other who are males are just making things worse.
Many thanks. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lisa, for the questions. We have another question from the audience. Yes.
Yes, actually, it's a very brief question. I was really glad to hear about Hungarian Utopias, because 2 weeks ago I finished the 2 books by Elena Ferrante. And it was like, I was wondering whether there was any kind of connection between Ferrante's world and these kind of utopias, because in Ferrante, like the scenes are replete with terror and violence. And it seems to me that what the countercultures that you describe go against not so much, the established order, but also this kind of terroristic violence that was very much there in Italy in the 1960s and 70s. I'm not an expert. It's just it was so good to hear about the same era.
No, thank you. Yeah, no, thank you for the comment. I think, I don't know so much, because I have to admit I haven't read Ferrante's work, so this is not a good. This would be better for Professor Luisa Passerini, because I'm no expert either. But I'm not sure if she. I think she would building. But thank you for your enthusiasm about Italian utopia.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Do we have maybe one last question or comment? I think Zsolt, you raised. Okay. So we have one last burning question or comment from the audience. Andre?
I have one question. I enjoyed all papers, but I have a question for Iva, because I really enjoyed the depiction of barbarians and the Hungary. Especially if we consider some comparison, because we know that figure, of course, from Bloch, I think they communicated with him somehow, or from surrealism, or from Czech modern at that time, but mostly it was some form of like provocation for one moment. Yes, surrealists declared that they are barbarians, and they declared years after something completely different. In this case, was it somehow like more elaborate and more enduring in their activity, or did they return after the period of the journal? Did they return to it when Peter became severe nationalist? Did he came back with his barbarian idea? So it was also provocation for one moment.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely, you're right. I would say that like a lot of these examples that you were mentioning, the Central European avant-garde feel is there. So it is very, grounded in that time. So it is a kind of a provocation. And I think that's the problem with a lot of these movements. Now I'm like doing research on another Hungarian journal published in Vojvodina Ut. And so it was a circle of these people that were supporting each other, and artistic movements they were definitely, so they had like expressed, they were mostly interested in Dadaism or Futurism or Expressionism. And at the same time, they were very, they had a lot of utopian impulses, I think. But you're definitely right. It's something, and then after 5 years, it's either financial stuff or it's just the community, disappears. So it's a very specific thing in time, but that's what I would say. But in this case, it's interesting because Micic, after he did go to, and this is what I was mentioning in the second phase, if you call it like that, after in the 40s, he writes a novel, and the novel is still, this is like, explicitly Serbian nationalist, and he has another manifesto that is something like Serbian, it's in the title, I cannot remember now, but the novel is still around this idea. It's called The Barbarian Decivilizer. So I think he takes that idea too. That was his life project, basically. So in his case, he never gave up the idea. The circle around him did, eventually, I would say. Yeah. But he stayed on with it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, please join me in thanking our three distinguished speakers.